Join me as I say a heartfelt thank you to all volunteer firefighters and their families, and be ever so mindful of the importance of their roles in the lives of so many. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. No more notices of motion. We'll move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:46. We'll conclude at 3:46. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Yesterday, members of the Law Amendments Committee heard from a large number of young Nova Scotians who object to the elimination of the graduate retention rebate. I think one young Nova Scotian, Robert Parker, put it best when he said, and I quote, and I'll table the quote, "Given the disappointing results since the Ivany report came out, even those of us who are most committed to living in Nova Scotia are thinking about whether it makes sense to stay and for how long." I'd like to ask the Premier, at a time when our province needs more young people than ever, why is his government disappointing them instead of making it easier for them to stay?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what most of the presenters said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, is that the program, the GRR program, Mr. Speaker, did not do what it was intended to do. What they were actually concerned about was the fact that all of that money was not put back into reducing tuition or rebate programs, Mr. Speaker. What we have heard loud and clear from university graduates, community college graduates, graduates from high school, Mr. Speaker, is that they need a job, something to attach them to the workforce. Mr. Speaker, what we have done is targeted job creation opportunities for the people of this province, and young Nova Scotians will get an opportunity to work and raise their families in this province. And like every government, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work on the affordability of post-secondary education.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, in fact, what we heard over and over again last night from our young, best and brightest is that they feel betrayed by this government, which cancelled the retention rebate program with nothing to take its place, Mr. Speaker. In fact, they are looking for jobs, Mr. Speaker, and we have a report, the Ivany report, that makes many recommendations on how to turn the economy around. But this government, in its first budget, turned its back on the Ivany report and has nothing in place to get going on creating the jobs that we all so desperately want, particularly our young, best and brightest. So no wonder they are disappointed, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Premier, where in the Ivany report does it say to find new ways to disappoint young Nova Scotians and send them away?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that is one of the most pathetic questions I've ever heard in this House. Mr. Speaker, this government will continue to work with the business community across this province to provide good opportunities for university and community college graduates to stay and work in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what is pathetic is that a whole group of young Nova Scotians, our best and brightest, had to come down to Province House and demand action from a government that has 2 sessions of this House under its belt and 6 months and a roadmap to success from the Ivany report that sits back and does nothing but disappoint them and listen to them tell the government that they're betrayed by a government that cancels their one hope of a job here that gives young Nova Scotians the highest tax increase in our province's history. That is what is pathetic, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier this. The title of the Ivany report is Now or Never. So how long will young Nova Scotians have to wait before they actually do something positive for them instead of take things away?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we have done, Mr. Speaker, is invested in young Nova Scotians. We've, Mr. Speaker, broadened the apprenticeship opportunities, Mr. Speaker, in this province. Mr. Speaker, for decades, Mr. Speaker, people have been looking...
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
For decades, people have told us we had to do something about apprenticeship opportunities in this province. In 6 months, Mr. Speaker, we delivered. for the people of this province. Mr. Speaker, young Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, want to do research and have had to leave this province and go to Ontario and other parts of Canada. We've delivered for those university graduates, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, one of the things the Ivany report said was we need to engage the private sector. This government is engaging the private sector to create job opportunities for those university and community college graduates here at home.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, as we've seen in Alberta, despite repeated assurances that amalgamating their former 9 health regions into one would save millions in administrative costs, those savings have not materialized and costs have skyrocketed. Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Health said the cost of amalgamating Nova Scotia's 9 DHAs would be, and I quote, minimal. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, would the Premier explain what are the areas the Department has identified that will add to this minimal cost of amalgamation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think what has been said prior to the last election, during the last election, and, Mr. Speaker, since the last election is what we're going to be doing is taking the savings out of administration, Mr. Speaker, and drive into frontline health care. What we're going to take is, instead of an administrative-focused health care system, we're going to make sure it's focused on patients.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my office has obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and I'll table a briefing note regarding amalgamation costs. The Department of Health and Wellness have identified a whole slew of early costs associated with DHA amalgamation. Consultant costs, staff costs, travel costs, information technology and systems change costs, including SAP requirements, and Mr. Speaker, we know that could end up being a bit expensive. Polling and communication costs, new board costs, and severance costs. These are the early costs, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, now that we know the Department knows there will be a lot of costs for DHA amalgamations, why won't the Premier tell Nova Scotians how much his reorganization of health care is really going to cost?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable member would know that would have been advice to the minister. Unlike the former government, we will take the best possible advice, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that the decisions we make are in the best interest of all Nova Scotians, and we will ensure that our healthcare system is focused on patients and not administration.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Well, if the Premier would check, he would see that healthcare administrative costs went down by 2%. Under the previous administration. His plan is going to add to the administrative costs of health care in the province. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has repeatedly said that he could not provide an estimate of the cost of the DHA amalgamation because estimates have not yet been developed. But that same briefing note says that there are estimates for all the categories that I have outlined today, and the briefing note indicates the financial component has been approved. So, Mr. Speaker, unless the Premier is prepared to tell this House that he has given the Minister of Health a blank check for DHA amalgamation, I again ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, what are the estimated costs for Health Board amalgamation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, on the election of October 8th, Nova Scotians said no longer will be blank checks be delivered by any government in this province, and they gave the government who wrote blank checks at walking papers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure, Mr. Speaker, what I've given the Minister of Health is my full confidence on his ability to deliver a patient-focused health care centre.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, it turns out that Nova Scotia's manufacturing exports fell again last month and are now down almost 9% over the past year, and I will table that for the benefit of the House. That is the worst performance in all of Canada. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because the Ivany report specifically says we should focus on manufacturing jobs because those are good jobs, Mr. Speaker. They hear the Premier saying that's not his problem, that's up to the private sector. But I will ask the Premier, in light of this abysmal performance in such an important area of our economy, what more evidence does he need to take some action instead of being hands-off when it comes to the Ivany report recommendations?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think if he actually continued to read the Ivany report, what it says, Mr. Speaker, those decisions should not be made by Cabinet. They should be made by an arm's-length board of business leaders. That's why we've created Invest Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're expanding the opportunity for NSBI to respond to that. And, Mr. Speaker, our government will continue to deliver to ensure that not only in the manufacturing sector, but every small business in this province get an opportunity to hire highly qualified, trained individuals in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here are some decisions that have been made by the Cabinet under the new government. We pay the highest taxes in the country. The young graduates got the biggest tax increase, 275% in our province's history. That they're going to drive our provincial debt up by another $500 million this year and $1 billion in total under their mandate using their own budget numbers. Those are decisions made by the Cabinet that they take ownership of, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to implementing the Ivany report, a roadmap to turn our economy around, they're hands off and say, no, that's for somebody else to do. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not good enough. No wonder so many young Nova Scotians came here last night to say they feel betrayed by this government. So I'll ask the Premier, when will he listen to the very young Nova Scotians who want to see a real plan like the Ivany report in place in this House to turn the economy around and create jobs?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we listen to all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we had a whole group of young Nova Scotians here looking for leadership from this government to turn the economy around, to follow the Ivany report, to do what it takes to get our economy in a better place through less regulation and lower taxes and real opportunities. And what they got for all the listening the government claims is a 275% increase in their income tax if they stay in Nova Scotia. Nowhere in the Ivany report does it say to find new ways to send young Nova Scotia graduates away, but that's what they got from this government, Mr. Speaker. There is a reason that the Ivany report is called Now or Never. And one young Nova Scotian was very clear last night that what they hear from this government is that when they ask for hope, the answer they got from the Liberal government is never. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why has he chosen never when so many young Nova Scotians need help now?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work with Nova Scotians to provide them the opportunities here at home. One of the things in the last 6 months, Mr. Speaker, is this government provided more opportunities for young people in Nova Scotia. I'm very proud of the fact that the Minister of Finance has laid out a very realistic plan of where we are when it comes to the budgeting process. We've engaged Nova Scotians. We're going to continue to work with the business community across this province, Mr. Speaker, to drive good job opportunities here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, my question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. The economy in Nova Scotia has been stalled for years, and we obviously need a jump start. Statistics Canada releases regional data that shows a 3-month moving average for labour force characteristics. In Cape Breton, over the last 5 years, as of March 2014, population has decreased by 5,900, labour force has decreased by 2,800, the current unemployment rate is 16.3%, and there are currently 9,400 unemployed people in Cape Breton, and I will table that document. Is the Minister aware of the increased unemployment in Cape Breton, and perhaps if the Minister can share with the members of this House what steps the Liberal government has taken to address this alarming show of stats for the Cape Breton region specifically?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that should be clear to the member opposite is that we are putting together a plan that helps create the playing field for business to succeed. And Mr. Speaker, government doesn't create jobs. We've been very clear on that. The private sector creates jobs. Our job, Mr. Speaker, is to make it possible for businesses, including small and medium-sized businesses here in Nova Scotia, to succeed. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary, or pardon me, her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, Cape Breton Island is not the only area in Nova Scotia suffering from high unemployment rates. Southern Nova Scotia, over the same period of time, has seen a decrease by 4,800. Full-time employment has decreased by 5,700. Labour force has decreased by 5,100, and the population has decreased by 4,500. The unemployment rate is 14.3%, and there are 7,700 people who are unemployed. Is the minister aware of these recent released stats? And if so, what steps is the minister taking to address the unemployment rate and decrease population specifically to Southern Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. I would remind the member opposite the Yarmouth Ferry would be a perfect example of what this government has done to increase employment in southwest Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Denise did that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Youth in Nova Scotia are struggling, and just last night in the Law and Amendments, I listened to over 40 very articulate and inspiring students who are struggling. Jobs are not here for them, and on top of that, graduates have just received the biggest tax increase they will probably ever see. Our young people between the ages of 15 and 24 over the past 5 years have seen their population decrease by 7,200, full-time employment decreased by 4,000, part-time employment decreased by 3,000. The unemployment rate for this age group across the province is 20%. Why hasn't the minister done anything to spur on the labour force for young people where 1 in 5 are unemployed?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know where the member opposite has been, but we've had a number of announcements recently that, in fact, speak directly to young people. For example, our special operating agency, the bill that is in fact before this House, is one of the things that we are doing to help young Nova Scotians train quicker than they have in the past, have a more effective system, and find good jobs here in Nova Scotia. We have the Graduate to Opportunities program, which my colleague, the Minister for Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, will be unveiling shortly, and to which we have alluded repeatedly. We have also created a graduate scholarship program, which we announced last week, which was an initiative that was put forward by Students Nova Scotia, supported by Concept, the organization that all the university presidents participate in. There are a variety of different things that we have done for young Nova Scotians to try and make sure that they actually get the jobs that they're entitled to. And, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that in 2008, we saw young males in particular take a huge drop in employment, and those young men are some of the people that we're going to be focusing our efforts on in the coming years, because they are not in the workforce. And, Mr. Speaker, we think that's a shame.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI, has noted that healthcare administrative cost ratios have been declining in Nova Scotia from 6.3% in 08-09 to an estimated 4.59% in 12-13. Mr. Speaker, that's a 2% decrease in 4 years. That the costs of Nova Scotia's health administration have been reduced, in fact, to the levels of other provinces in the country. So, Mr. Speaker, according to the briefing note that I tabled earlier, we now know that the Health Department has identified that DHA amalgamation costs will include everything from hiring consultants to polling and severance, and those costs will be anything but minimal. So my question for the Minister of Health is, why is the Minister and the Premier avoiding letting the public know what these costs are going to be?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to respond to that question. And one of the notes that the member opposite has made is a catalogue of areas in which some costs can be incurred during the restructuring process. But one of the great discoveries that I have made that perhaps the former minister hadn't, and that is the great expertise that is in our province, in our Department of Health. We are not using any outside consultants.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Well, that is very good to know, but Mr. Speaker, there are a slew of other costs associated with this amalgamation. It's here in this briefing note in black and white. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has been attempting to downplay the cost of consolidating health boards, suggesting it's going to be minimal. However, according to the Minister's own briefing note, and I quote, "There will be costs incurred in transition year and the first years of implementation." Mr. Speaker, that's years, plural, with an S. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Premier or to the Minister is this: how many years will Nova Scotia see administrative costs increase due to the DHA amalgamation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and we are taking a very thoughtful and strategically planned move into the one health board or two health boards with the IWK, the provincial board, and we don't plan to do it all in 1 year. We're going to respect a lot of the good number of the leaders in our healthcare system and allow attrition to assist us, which in fact will be a big part of moving towards a smaller number of administrators throughout the province. So whether it'll be 2 or 3 years to accomplish that, that's what the transition and advisory group, who now started their work under the very capable direction and leadership of former CEO Pat Lee.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, Alberta, New Brunswick, and now Nova Scotia's own experience under the last Liberal government has shown that the costs of health administration rise under healthcare reorganization schemes. And according to an article in the Edmonton Journal from January of 2011, I quote, "The first full fiscal year with that new health authority in charge saw administrative costs rise to $390 million, an increase of $43 million or 13% over 1 year. So my last question to the Minister of Health: when will the Minister finally reveal what the estimated cost of amalgamating the boards will be, and for how many years will Nova Scotia be paying the bill for this with healthcare dollars?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to respond to that question. I know that probably by September we'll have a better idea of what it may cost and the time period. We've allowed Pat Lee to provide a great deal of work over the next 4 months on giving us the final structure. But one thing I know for sure, Mr. Speaker, is that when we finish the process, we will have a leaner and more responsive administrative team that puts the emphasis on leadership and quality patient care first and foremost. Thank you.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. People in southwestern Nova Scotia are very unhappy with the service provided by Eastlink Communications, their broadband service. On a good day, their service, Mr. Speaker, is probably somewhere near dial-up. And yet they're paying full price for their broadband fees. Today I introduced two petitions with just about 700 signatures of people who are disappointed with this service. So my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is, since this service was partially funded by government, what actions can the department take to bring these residents into the current century?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. This is a subject that we had the opportunity to discuss with some of his colleagues in the official opposition during estimates. The fact was that a broadband initiative for Nova Scotia was announced in 2006. I believe he may have been part of the government of the day, and it was an ambitious announcement at the time and an ambitious goal. We're now the third government that's been dealing with this issue, and we're disappointed by the fact that there still remains a number of people, both in southwest Nova Scotia and in the Valley area, that do not have connectivity, or, as the member is pointing out, that the level of service is not what anyone would describe as being high speed. What I can tell the member is that right now the contract with Eastlink expires in the end of December of this year. We have been in communications with the company to express our disappointment that there are still too many Nova Scotians without high-speed service in the area in question, and we are starting to hear more about service issues for those who are connected. So I can assure the member that there are continued discussions taking place, and we do hope that Eastlink will be bringing a proposal forward to resolve this.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And we know there's a lot of logistics that are involved in this one as well, but you know, in 2014, to say that you have broadband service, you have the connection, you have the wireless system there, that you're only connecting at speeds somewhere close to dial-up is really not acceptable. To add insult to injury to the residents along that corridor, the number 3 highway that goes from Pubnico Head through East Pubnico, through the Woods Harbors, into Shag Harbor and on to Barrington, there is internet, there is cable. Maybe not of a service that can provide internet, but at least the wires are going by there. We know of at least 2 fiber connections that go through that area as well. So why can they not piggyback off that? So my question to the minister is really, if the contract is coming due and they might put an RFP out or negotiate with the Eastlink. I just wonder which way is he going with this one? If they're not going to be able to provide the service that is acceptable to Nova Scotians, will he put that out for another RFP?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Well, it would be premature to judge what's going to happen in light of the fact that the contract does continue until the end of December of this year. But in the meantime, our government certainly has not been waiting for that day. I've had the opportunity to hold a number of meetings on this subject to try to encourage a resolution and try to ensure that people have high-speed service regardless of where they live in the province. The member is probably also aware that the federal government recently announced funding would be coming to increase the speed up to 5 BPS, I think is the term, but 5 is the number. I know that many Nova Scotians are not achieving that now, and so we wait to see exactly how the federal government is going to provide such funding, and we will certainly be there as a partner if such funding is made available to try to ensure not only we address the connectivity issues which are still outstanding, but as well that we make sure that Nova Scotians are getting the quality high speed that they need in order to maintain our province's competitive edge in that regard. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Je remercie le ministre pour cette réponse, mais en même temps, I think what we need to understand is that these people are unable to do the work that they really need to do. If you're putting remittances in with CRA, if you're doing some basic internet, like sending a picture to a friend or even cruising on Facebook, they really can't do it. And we know what Facebook does to the rest of us is it's our way to keep connected to the area. And I know the member for Yarmouth, the Minister of DNR, there's people in his constituency through the Pygmies Point area, around Melbourne into Camoes Hill, that are having the same kind of connection problem. And I know that we really need to work hard to ensure that they are brought into the current century. So hearing all the answers that the Minister is given, maybe I'll just give him another opportunity to give maybe a little synopsis on how this is going to unroll, because again, it is lots of moving pieces, lots of people that are involved in it. Is it just working with Eastlink, or is it going to be a program that's going to be rolled out to other players?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à mon collègue. C'est sans question avoir accès à l'Internet à haute vitesse. Selon moi, je l'ai dit à plusieurs reprises ici à la maison, c'est la même chose qu'avoir accès à l'électricité. C'est une nécessité, ce n'est pas un privilège, mais c'est quelque chose que tous les gens de la Nouvelle-Écosse ont le droit, et puis qu'ils s'attendent d'avoir ce service-là. Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable member, it's always great to see the use of both official languages here in the House, but Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we will be working closely with the federal government. But I guess as I told the members' colleagues during the budget estimates, is that there are discussions that are taking place. I'm not at liberty to share those discussions on the floor of the House, but I want to assure the member and all colleagues we take this matter very seriously. We are encouraging Eastlink to come up with a solution to this. We are hopeful that that is going to happen. Those discussions will continue to take place, and the minute we're in a position to provide more information, I assure you, Mr. Speaker, that we will make all members and all Nova Scotians aware of how exactly we are going to address this issue. Merci.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, last night approximately 40 Nova Scotian students and young graduates appeared at Law Amendments to tell us how the government and the Premier had betrayed them. To demonstrate this betrayal, the Dalhousie Student Union presented a lengthy list of broken promises the Liberals had made, which I will table. Now, Mr. Speaker, prior to the election, the Premier and members of his cabinet made it very clear they were going to make university more affordable and improve programs that could help retain graduates in Nova Scotia. But instead, what has the Premier done in his first budget? He's cut $50 million that supported students and graduates, money that has not been reinvested. Mr. Speaker, this is a far cry from comments made by the Premier on November the 23rd, 2011, when he was in opposition, and I quote, "We should be doing everything we can to encourage our young people to learn and work in Nova Scotia." So my question for the Premier is this: how is taking $50 million away from students and grads and not reinvesting it in programs that would encourage them to learn and work in Nova Scotia doing everything we can?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member that not one student actually was receiving any of that money, Mr. Speaker. Students have told us loud and clearly that they want an opportunity to work in this province. What we've done, Mr. Speaker, is targeted towards job creation to provide those young people with a job in this province so they can stay here, work, and raise their family.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the Premier didn't have an opportunity to hear the students firsthand last night, because student leaders spoke of their frustration that the Liberal government had used their expressed desire for improvements to the graduate retention rebate as an excuse to eliminate the program. This is not what students had been asking for, Mr. Speaker. And once again, this is not the Liberal government they were promised just 6 months ago. Mr. Speaker, on October 5th, 2009, the current health minister said, and I quote, "We always had the ability to improve and move forward with a retention program that I think can be much more based in accessibility and in lowering tuition rates. So my question to the Premier is this: in cutting the graduate retention rebate and not reinvesting most of that money back into programs for students, where is the program the Minister of Health spoke about in opposition that would be based in accessibility and in lowering tuition rates?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the leader of the Democratic Party is not telling Nova Scotians is that all of the information, all of the history of this program shows it wasn't working. So she's suggesting we should continue to plow money into programs that aren't working. What we've said very clearly is that this is about job creation. We need to provide opportunities for young university, community college, and high school students to get a job here in this province. We are targeting towards working with small business owners to ensure that happens. We've invested in research opportunities. While they were in government, Mr. Speaker, young Nova Scotians were leaving this province to do research in other parts of this Canada. We've said that's not good enough. Let's invest in research and give them an opportunity here. Mr. Speaker, we continue to do some of the work that I know the minister from Cape Breton, the member from Cape Breton Centre was working on when he was Minister of Labour, which is ensuring that more apprentice opportunities are here in Nova Scotia. That's what we're investing in. It's about creating a job in this province so that young Nova Scotians can stay and work at home.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, probably the most common theme from last night was that the Premier and government members who said they were on the side of students when they were in opposition are now ignoring the concerns that students have that they're in government. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier isn't actually my own question. It's a question that was first asked by the member of Bedford when she was in opposition, and I quote, "Why is it okay to be on the side of students when you are in opposition and then ignore them when you go into government?"
The Honourable Premier.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for such a great question, Mr. Speaker. I think it's the best one of the three she's provided so far, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I agree with her. I agree with her, Mr. Speaker. It's why we put investment in job opportunities in this province for young Nova Scotian. But there's no question there's more work to be done, and this government will continue to work with student leaders, university presidents, and people across this province to ensure that we can make sure university is affordable for all young Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you tonight, this afternoon is to the Minister of Health. A couple of weeks ago, we learned that the palliative care patients were spending their final days in a rodent-infested ward. Last week, we found out that the cardiovascular intensive care unit is dealing with a scabies outbreak. You know, patients and families are at their most vulnerable when they enter our healthcare system, yet they continue to be subjected to second-rate conditions. So my question to the Minister, what does he say to the Nova Scotians who are looking for health care but are finding mice and mites?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And those are conditions that are unacceptable in terms of the total requirements of good quality patient care in respect to their environment. We do know, all Nova Scotians know, that the Centennial building is in a very deteriorated condition. What I can assure the member from Argyle is that both those situations now are indeed well under control, and the one guarantee that I know, and he as a former minister know, is that there's no second-rate care at the QE2.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And I didn't say the care was second-rate. I definitely said that the conditions were second-rate. And Mr. Speaker, you know, for a long time we've been dealing with issues, especially with the Centennial building. Mr. Speaker, you know, this was, I think, a bit of a disturbing trend, though. And I think the communication issue, I think that was underlined, is one that will continue to be important for the minister, because I believe he needs to know things are happening when they are happening, not a couple of days late, which I think what happened in both of these instances right now. So I'm just wondering, how are you going to stay, or how is the minister going to stay on top of these issues? Because it's only, it's him and his department that can make these changes to make patients' lives more bearable when they're in a facility like the Centennial Building.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member from Argyll. One of the approaches that is being taken immediately at the QE2 is taking a look at all of the units in terms of their physical environment, while they also do some staff assessment as well. And so this will be an ongoing challenge to make sure that a deteriorating environment, is, if you wish, looked after as fully as possible, to make sure that people's stay, long or short, does not have to deal with issues that we have had in the last couple of weeks.
The Honourable Member for Argyll-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it seems like it was just yesterday, but it was quite some time ago when we were having problems in the transition unit in that same building, where it did get closed down. The patients got transferred to other units in the system. So I'm wondering, is there an opportunity to relook at the way we're providing care, especially when it comes to the Centennial Building, so that outbreaks like rodents and mice and scabies will not continue to plague our system and allow surgeries and life kinds of procedures to be done in our healthcare system. I mean, we can't allow these things to happen so that our system doesn't continue to get bogged down with those kinds of issues. So I'm just wondering, maybe the minister can talk quickly about how we're going to move on from this. How can we identify other places for these individuals to go to get the life-changing services that they do need from our healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And having met with some of the management from the QE2 to do everything that they can in terms of making sure that that pest control, also that housekeeping has a more robust approach to making sure that that rooms do get the kind of cleaning and all of the important hygienic practices are indeed taking place, as well as currently staff are getting, I guess, somewhat of a to-do list in terms of taking all the kinds of precautions that will mean safety for themselves as healthcare providers, as well as the patients that they come in contact each and every day.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you today is to the Premier. In a video produced for the Nova Scotia Liberal Party, and the newly elected leader of the Liberal Party said in 2008, and I quote, "We have the second highest gas taxes in the country. The only thing we have any control over at all is the tax we charge on a litre of gas. They, the PC government of the day, just don't have the resolve to make it happen." End of quote. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why can't the Premier just agree that he doesn't have the same resolve that he talked about in opposition now that he's in government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to first of all thank the honourable member for reviewing some of the messages I've been trying to deliver over the last 7 years, Mr. Speaker. But I want to thank him for the question. It is obviously it's a very serious issue, Mr. Speaker, that many Nova Scotians are feeling the cost of the rise of gasoline in this province. It's why I've committed to when I meet with premiers of Atlantic Canada in May, to talk about decoupling the tax, Mr. Speaker, so that we do not charge the HST on top of the motor fuel tax here in Atlantic Canada, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation on behalf of Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the Liberals are in power, the Premier has changed his tune once again. On Friday, the Premier suggested in the Chronicle Herald article that the only way to move forward with changes to gas pricing in Nova Scotia is to go at it with the other maritime provinces, the answer the Premier just gave. But, Mr. Speaker, once again, I remind the Premier that when he was in opposition, he said the only thing we have any control over at all, our province he was talking about, is the gas tax charge that we on a litre of gas. So, Mr. Speaker, this is just another example that what the Premier said was saying one thing prior to the election and doing something else when he's in government. So I would ask the Premier very nicely, why has the Premier changed his tune now that he's in government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the honourable member for the nice question. Mr. Speaker, with all seriousness, as I've said to this House, I will be talking to the other Atlantic premiers in May when I meet with them in New Brunswick to look at decoupling the HST from motor fuel tax in this province, which, in my view, Mr. Speaker, would not only provide relief to the motoring public, but I think it's the right thing for Atlantic governments to do in conjunction with the federal government.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And all we're trying to do is to make sure that Nova Scotians understand the true position of the government. We know their position in opposition. It's a little different now in government. Even the Premier's own finance minister, Mr. Speaker, even the Premier's own finance minister doesn't agree with him. She said in the same article that I just tabled, Mr. Speaker, that it would be really irresponsible to start rebating taxes or changing our tax system in a way that would just put us deeper in the hole. So I know with those concerns from the Minister of Finance, it was on the Premier's position. I believe maybe his first position or the second one or maybe the new one that he has now, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to ask the Premier, could he clarify to all Nova Scotians what is his position on taking the tax off the gasoline price here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've said to the previous two questions, I'm going to engage the Atlantic premiers, Mr. Speaker, on ensuring that we look at decoupling the tax so we don't charge the HST on the motor fuel tax. It will allow us, of course, we will need the support of the federal government. I want to remind the honourable member, just imagine how much we could reduce the taxes in this province if they hadn't given so much away in the last 4 years.
The honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Hiking is a healthy and affordable activity that most Nova Scotians are able to participate in. And Nova Scotia is home to a great number of hiking and coastal trails, and stakeholders are looking for ways to better use and maintain them. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister work with Hike Nova Scotia to create a hiking strategy to promote greater usage for our existing trails and our trail inventory that we have now?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. I first want to thank all the great volunteers in various communities across this province that have done incredible work getting our trails operational and functioning. I think there's great potential there, not just for economic and tourism benefits, Mr. Speaker, but also for health and wellness in the province. I'm happy to meet with Hike Nova Scotia or any other stakeholders that are interested in developing this great asset that we have in the province and ensuring that all Nova Scotians and visitors to the province reap the benefits. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Health. And I can't say that it'll be a nice question, but it's a very serious question. Mr. Speaker, pulmonary fibrosis is a devastating lung disease affecting thousands of people across the country. As the disease progresses, individuals have a very low quality of life and suffer each day. A new drug approved by Health Canada is aspirin, which can improve lung and extend the lives of those affected. However, it is not covered in Nova Scotia, and it does cost $40,000 a year. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister consider extending provincial pharmacare coverage to this new drug?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite is that in the next few weeks, it is one of those briefings and reviews that we will be taking a look at the department. I am very familiar, having met national representatives who have provided background on the devastating impacts of this disease, and so it's an area that we will be getting more information, and also especially around the new treatment that is available.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for that answer. Individuals and their families are reaching out to their government because this drug offers them hope. Environmental exposure to contaminants like coal dust, silica and asbestos are believed to be the leading causes of this disease, and Mr. Speaker, I'll table a document to that effect. As the Minister knows, exposures to these materials is something many Nova Scotians have endured while working in industries like steel manufacturing and coal mining. Because of our special circumstances, the province should immediately look into the coverage of aspirin. Will the Minister commit to looking at aspirin coverage based on these special circumstances of the individuals of our province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member opposite for that question. These people have developed this lung condition through no fault of theirs, very often induced by the workplace conditions that they labored in, and I think it's an important issue for us to review in the coming weeks and get some idea of the number of Nova Scotians that are impacted, and also review with some other jurisdictions how they've gone about dealing with this new treatment.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the Minister. But over time, the shortness of breath patients experience begins to deprive vital organs of the necessary oxygen needed to survive. Without a lung transplant, life expectancy ranges from only 2 to 5 years, and Mr. Speaker, I'll table a document to that effect. Like many of these serious diseases, time is not a friend to these people. So my final question to the Minister of Health: what advice can the Minister give families of patients who are suffering from this disease, who haven't got a lot of time to advocate and wait for this drug to help their loved ones?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, for bringing this to the floor of the legislature. And it is indeed a disease with a debilitating, outlook for these patients as time goes along, and it is one that we'll need to give consideration to in very short order. And once again, I thank the member for bringing the question to the floor.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Residential Tenancies Act. Last night we began to hear about a landlord who is trying to evict residents from the Troy Trailer Court as early as June 11th. From what I understand, the landlord cannot do that unless residents have not paid the rent or if there are issues of poor behavior. Residents must be given 12 months' notice, and that only comes after an order is approved by a residential tenancies officer. Can the Minister confirm if that is correct?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague across the floor for the question. Certainly want to recognize the anxiety and upheaval that these circumstances are presenting to the residents in this community. The purpose of the Residential Tenancy Act is to provide efficient and cost-effective means for dispute resolution. And the Act specifically outlines what's required of landlords in their dealings with tenants and the options available to landlords. And the circumstances that my colleague has presented are in fact accurate.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is reassuring to know for the people that are living there that there is some protection for them. As I understand, residents can file an application to ensure they get the required 12 months. Can the minister explain if that is necessary for all residents to file that application, or if at least one resident files that application, will that take care of everybody in the area in question?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know from discussion with staff that individual tenants have had contact with our access centre in Port Hawkesbury, as well as our provincial contact centre, and they're being provided the instruction consistent with the legislation in the Act to file individual applications for purposes of moving this matter forward.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the residents deserve more respect, I believe, from their landlord. I don't believe this is any way to treat people to just come out and try to evict people in only a short time of 6 weeks. Will the minister confirm for those residents today, as he has in his past two answers, but will the minister confirm that he will use the laws found in the Residential Tenancies Act to protect them for at least the next 12 months so that they have proper time to make arrangements for a new home?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again thank my colleague for the question. The points being made are very appropriate, and I think the bottom line here is that to give legal eviction notices to close these land lease communities or any community where there's a tenancy landlord agreement, a landlord would be required to make that application through the process. And I can assure my colleague in opposition and the residents of this land lease community that we will apply the legislation as it was intended to protect the best interests of those homeowners and tenants.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs, the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the community of Eskasoni was in distress back in 2008 after a series of youth suicides. With the assistance of the federal and provincial governments at the time, Mr. Speaker, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis line was established. And in 2012, the province took over the larger share of that funding when the federal government backed out. In a recent Department of Health briefing note obtained under the Freedom of Information request, and I'll table that in a second, Mr. Speaker, shows that the current Liberal government will provide no further funding to sustain the Eskasoni hotline, Mr. Speaker. So I want to know through you to the Premier, could the Premier please explain why his government is removing support from this vital service?
The Honourable Premier and the Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I had the great privilege of being in Eskasoni a few months ago. The tremendous work that the community is doing, how optimistic, quite frankly, I felt when I left with the fact that so many young people are hopeful for the future, being trained, looking at chances to create their own businesses, create opportunities in that province. The crisis hotline was part of the conversation that we had with the Chief and the Council. Part of that discussion was ensuring that as the crisis hotline, which is actually distributed across the entire province, actually could become part of what the Aboriginal community in the province could continually to work towards and build into.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I somewhat respect the answer that it didn't go a mile near the question. The fact is that your government is not going to support this crisis line. This crisis line, Mr. Speaker, is very unique. And as the member that represents it, the member from Victoria the Lakes could rightfully say, Mr. Speaker, the government plans to use, in this case, a one-size-fits-all. But, Mr. Speaker, this is very important to our First Nations people to have such a crisis line where they can be talk to their peers, especially in their own language, and that is very, very important, Mr. Speaker, because it is much broader than what the original version had contemplated. It was just as bad as suicides are and were, that it expanded into many aspects of communal life within that First Nations community. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate and ask the Premier again through you, Mr. Speaker, is why doesn't his government see the value of that line, and why won't he invest in it?
The Honourable Premier and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs with 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We absolutely see the value in that service, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're ensuring that the crisis hotline across the province deals with the issues the member brought forward around language and in the culture, Mr. Speaker. We want to ensure that all Aboriginal communities will be covered by a broad-based program across the province. We're continuing that conversation with leaders, with chiefs in every Aboriginal community in this province to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that they feel that they're receiving the services from their government that they deserve. And I want to congratulate the Minister of Health, who I know as recently as today has met with a number of the chiefs on this very issue. Because let's be clear, this government is going to continue to invest to ensure that Aboriginal communities and every community across this province get access to a hotline to ensure that any Nova Scotian who feels in need of supports, we will be there.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre, 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I would have been much more reassured had the Premier said that they would all have it, maybe in particular to First Nations, Mr. Speaker, but I'm worried about the program now because I am afraid it will not be expanded.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. Just before we move on to government motions, I'd like to take this opportunity to do an introduction of some very special guests that have joined us in the Speaker's Gallery. If everybody would direct their attention, I would take great pleasure to introduce former MLAs who are here on the second reading of the ex-MLA bill. We're pleased to have with us the Honourable Jim Smith, who served as MLA for Dartmouth East. MLA for Dartmouth East from 1984 to 2003. We're also extremely pleased to have with us the chairperson of the ex-MLAs Association, the fantastic Jeremy Akerman, who served as MLA for Cape Breton East